So I thought today we could consider Psalm 114. Psalm 114 is a short and repetitive psalm, but it's also quite interesting. In fact, most scholars would say, yeah, this is a praise psalm or a hymn, but it doesn't act like a typical praise psalm or hymn. In fact, once you get into it, it launches you right into a storied setting. In verse 1 it says, when Israel went out from Egypt, obviously taking us back to the Exodus, to this moment of Israel's removal from slavery and bondage into freedom, life, and hope. Now the reason why I wanted us to consider this psalm is because on Sunday morning, Easter morning, we were participating in an Easter vigil. And according to the Book of Common Prayer and other resources, what happens in an Easter vigil is you read a bunch of Old Testament texts of God's great redemptive work in the past, and it all leads up to reading the stories of Jesus' resurrection. And the onus of this act is to link all of these stories as if to say that God has been continually acting in human history, and also God has been acting in the lives of his people to bring about salvation. So Psalm 114, it stands in that tradition, and what it is attempting to do is to link the Exodus with other future acts of God. So I want to read through the entire psalm and then go back and highlight a few things that I think are interesting. So according to the NRSV, it says, when Israel went out from Egypt, the house of Jacob from a people of strange language, or as Robert Alter translates it, a people of barbarous tongue. Judah became God's sanctuary, Israel his dominion. The sea looked and fled, Jordan turned back. The mountains skipped like rams, the hills like lambs. Why is it, O sea, that you flee? O Jordan, that you turn back? O mountains, that you skip like rams? O hills like lambs? Tremble, O earth, at the presence of the Lord, at the presence of the God of Jacob, who turns the rock into a pool of water, the flint into a spring of water. So here what the psalmist is trying to do is clearly take the readers back to the Exodus and surrounding events in order for them to remember who God is. In fact, some people would say that in the very last line of the psalm, where it says, who turns the rock into a pool of water, the flint into a spring of water. Now, for the biblically literate folks, you might say, oh, that first line, it kind of sounds like when Moses was striking the rock and water was coming from it. Yeah, you're right. But other people would say that this reversal of rock into water and flint into a spring of water, it's pretty common within the period of the exile to talk about these reversals, whether it's going from Eden to a wilderness, which would be symbolic of leaving the promised land, being exiled out of that land, and then finding yourself in the wilderness, or eventually returning to the promised land, which would be a reversal of a wilderness wandering into an oasis, more or less, or a rock to a spring or pool of water. These reversals are emblematic of the work that God is doing. Now, if that's the case, if verse 8 is placing us in an exilic or a post-exilic context, 500, 600, some odd years after the Exodus, what the psalmist is doing now in this entirely new context is saying, remember the Exodus. Remember God's power, God's sovereignty, and God's presence with us back then. And remember that that is the same God now. It's so powerful. And how the psalmist is wanting to take these stories of Israel's past and bring them into the present, which is sort of what the Easter Vigil is attempting to do. I should also mention here that Psalm 114 is also read at the beginning of Passover meals, which are still observed today. This is not an ancient, long ago tradition. This is something that still happens. Participants will read Psalm 113 and 114 before the meal, and then I believe they'll read 115 through 118 after the meal. So people are still linking historical events from the distant past and bringing them into the present to gain hope in the midst of whatever their circumstances are. Perhaps a pandemic where we are trapped in our homes, gaining strength from these events. Now, I do want to highlight a couple of things in the psalm itself. I think it's important for us to kind of dive in. Here we do see that the whole thing is framed with this Exodus symbology, Israel going out from Egypt is classic Exodus language. In verse 3 it says, "The sea looked and fled." And now we're kind of beginning to dip our toes into some, I'm going to say a scary word here, but don't be scared, mythical concepts. For the ancient Near Eastern people, the sea was this force of chaos that God had to tame. And here God is demonstrating God's power over the sea. The sea sees what's about to happen and it flees, it splits, it spreads apart because God is in control. Then it turns and says, Jordan turned back. And now here, we're about 40 years or so past the Exodus event. We've got a new generation of people who have been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, and now they're crossing the Jordan River to go into the Promised Land, finally. But what's interesting is these two events, the Exodus crossing and the crossing of the Jordan River, with different people involved, they are linked. Joshua 4, it even says, "For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan for you until you crossed over, as the Lord your God did when you crossed over the Red Sea, which he dried up for us while we crossed." That's a loose paraphrase there of that verse, but it's linking these two moments in Israel's history, the Exodus and the Red Sea crossing. It goes on to say the mountains skipped like rams and the hills like lambs. Some scholars would link that with Mount Sinai and related Exodus type events. Other people would say this is more mythical language for creation. The things that are supposed to be stable, they're threatened by chaos, and God is able to calm them, to still them, to shape them, to place them. So again, for some scholars, they would say that this is a linking of Exodus and creation themes, all for this same point, that it's the same God who does these things that is now operating in our lives today. And then in verses 5 and 6, we have this rhetorical questioning. Why is it, O sea, that you flee, O Jordan, that you turn back, O mountains, that you skip like rams, O hills, like lambs? It's very poetic in the English text here. And then it concludes with this call, which if there is a call to praise, it's here. And if there is a call to praise, it's not to us, but it's to the earth. Tremble at the presence of the Lord, at the presence of the God of Jacob. Now here we see that this psalm, as terse as it is inviting readers even today to look back to these moments and say the God who did that is still present and is still moving and is still encouraging and with us today. So I'm hopeful, for Christians that are listening along, that we can connect these dots all the way through to the resurrection of Jesus, and hopefully gain some strength in knowing that God is not absent, but God is still working and moving even in our lives today. So we're going to throw the words on the screen behind me and then give you guys some time to meditate and to pray through this psalm and hopefully gain encouragement from it.